have never truly seen yourself. Not the face in the mirror, not the name you answer to, not the story you tell when someone asks who you are. Beneath the layers of identity, behind the opinions, memories, fears, and desires, there is something else. Or perhaps nothing at all. What if the you you've spent your life defending is just a mask made of thoughts? What if the self, the precious, personal I, is an illusion? This is not philosophy for the sake of cleverness. It is a doorway, a dangerous one. To cross it is to risk everything you think you are. And what lies on the other side is not oblivion, but freedom. Imagine an abandoned altar deep in a nameless forest. The stone steps have been overtaken by vines, and the once sacred symbols have faded to near invisibility. At the center stands a broken statue, its eyes eternally closed. They say a god died there, and yet pilgrims still arrive. They kneel, they pray, they ask for miracles, and swear they receive them. How can a dead god continue to act? The paradox of the undead god isn't about belief. It's about logic, presence, absence, and the strange persistence of what we claim to have left behind, yet never truly have. Some claim the 21st century killed God. Even before then, French philosopher Michel Foucault suggested that structures of knowledge had already killed the subject, and Friedrich Nietzsche famously declared, "God is dead, not by divine demise, but by human hands." We killed God the moment we declared we no longer needed him. We replaced churches with laboratories, rituals with algorithms. But something strange happened after God died. He didn't leave. Like an echo that refuses to fade, he lingered. In political speeches, in everyday ethics, in silent fears and whispered hopes. He remains in our money. In God we trust. In courtroom oaths. In our ideas of justice and redemption. Even in death, gods continue to operate. Like undead ideas that stagger through time, powered by the invisible force of once-held belief. That's the heart of the paradox. If God is dead, why do we keep behaving as if he were still alive? This paradox resonates in the work of philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who sees Christ as the moment when God becomes man and, by dying, liberates humanity from the divine order itself. Yet even liberated, many remain bound. The trauma of loss becomes a devotion to the trace. The tomb is empty, but mourning becomes permanent. We can extend this idea to other concepts we claim to have buried. Monarchy, scientific racism, biological determinism. How many doctrines have we declared outdated, yet still shape our behavior, our technologies, our laws? Freud suggested that what is repressed returns, and perhaps the undead God is the return of something we can no longer name, but which still governs us invisibly. Dead in discourse, alive in behavior. Imagine a civilization that burns its sacred books, tears down temples, and forbids prayer. Yet when it legislates, it still appeals to moral categories rooted in those same scriptures. It still judges right and wrong by ancient standards. And it still feels guilt. Guilt without doctrine. Guilt without heaven or hell. Just the lingering sense of something once sacred. That is what the paradox reveals. Some ideas, once created, never truly die. They may leave the stage, but they remain behind the curtains, pulling strings we no longer see. Karl Popper argued that a theory is scientific only if it can be falsified. The undead God defies that rule. He lives in a zone beyond proof or disproof, a cultural, historical presence rather than a theological one. The question is no longer, does God exist? But rather, what does it mean to live as if he does while claiming he doesn't? This paradox lives in our daily contradictions. The atheist who silently gives thanks. The scientist who avoids certain phrases, just in case. The secular society that still celebrates holy days. Small gestures that betray a deeper current. The divine may be dead in speech, but it lives in motion. In the end, the paradox of the undead God isn't about gods. It's about ghosts. The ghosts of ideas, structures, and habits that refuse to disappear. It's about what it truly means to kill a belief. Because perhaps beliefs don't die with arguments. Maybe they only sleep, waiting for the next generation to forget why they were abandoned. Nietzsche warned that by killing God, we would have to become gods ourselves. But we forgot to create new values. We forgot to bury the body. And now it walks, watches, and whispers through the corridors of our culture, like a zombie deity, not alive enough to lead, not dead enough to forget. And so we go on, silently praying at an open grave, offering flowers to a cracked statue, and wondering whether what moves us is a living force or just the stubborn echo of something we never truly let go. He stands alone on the edge of a crumbling world. The buildings are empty, the streets silent, and the sky a dull, unfeeling gray. There is no more war, no more struggle, no more noise. Humanity has vanished, not in fire nor in catastrophe, but in quiet surrender. And yet, there he is, breathing, thinking, watching, the last man. Friedrich Nietzsche gave us this figure, not as a prophecy, but as a warning. The last man is not the survivor of apocalypse, but the product of comfort. He is what emerges when ambition dies, when challenge is feared, when the desire for greatness is replaced by the hunger for safety. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? The last man asks, and then blinks. We have invented happiness, he says with a smirk, as the world around him dissolves into boredom. To understand the paradox of the last man, we must look not at destruction, but at success. Imagine a world where every disease has been cured, every need met, every conflict resolved. A world where no one is poor, hungry, or afraid. On paper, it is paradise, but in Nietzsche's eyes, it is a grave, because in that world, humanity no longer strives, no longer dreams. It merely persists. The last man is not evil nor cruel. He does not wage war or seek domination. He simply avoids discomfort. He chooses entertainment over depth, routine over risk, pleasure over purpose. He lives long, but shallowly. He avoids suffering, but also greatness. He does not fall, but neither does he rise. Nietzsche contrasts this figure with the Übermensch, the overman, a symbol of the human who creates values, embraces struggle, and affirms life in all its chaos. The overman dances on the edge of the abyss. The last man installs a fence around it and puts up a warning sign. In today's world, the shadow of the last man is everywhere, in the algorithms that feed us what we already like, in the convenience that cushions us from hardship, in the culture of optimization, where even emotions are scheduled and sanitized. We are surrounded by comfort and haunted by emptiness. Psychologist Viktor Frankl once said that what man truly needs is not a tensionless state, but the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. Remove the struggle, and we do not find peace. We find restlessness. The paradox is clear. We seek to eliminate discomfort, yet in doing so, we eliminate the very conditions that give life meaning. We see glimpses of the last man in ourselves, when we avoid difficult conversations, when we numb pain instead of understanding it, when we trade depth for convenience. He is not a distant figure. He is the part of us that prefers not to care too much, not to question too deeply, not to try too hard. And yet, the last man is not doomed to remain. His story is a mirror, not a sentence. He shows us what happens when we forget the beauty of difficulty, when we forget that purpose often hides behind resistance, when we choose comfort at the cost of growth. Nietzsche feared that modernity, in its hunger for peace and order, would erase the wild, creative, painful spark that makes us human, that we would become creatures who no longer believe in anything greater than stability, that we would laugh at those who still dream, and that, in doing so, we would survive, but not truly live. The last man smiles, content, but his contentment is a silence that echoes louder than despair. In the end, the paradox is this: the more we try to perfect the human condition, the more we risk losing what makes us human. The desire to eliminate suffering, though noble, can lead us to eliminate striving. And without striving, without the willingness to endure and to dare, what remains is not humanity, but its shell. The last man may be our future, or he may be our reflection in a moment of fatigue. But if we still feel discomfort, if we still ask why, then perhaps we are not yet him. Not entirely. A candle flickers in a darkened room. Smoke spirals upward, curling into forms that almost resemble symbols. Eyes, serpents, ancient alphabets. A figure sits cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books, bones, and silence. Not a priest, not a scientist, something in between. A seeker, one who believes that truth is not only hidden, but hidden on purpose. Not by accident, but by design. This is the world of divine occultism, the belief that ultimate truths are veiled, encoded, and accessible only to those willing to look beyond the surface. To many, the term occult conjures images of superstition and shadowy rites, but etymologically, it simply means hidden. In this sense, Divine occultism isn't about magic in the theatrical sense. It's about a worldview that the divine, the ultimate reality, God, truth, being, has deliberately concealed itself, and that seeking it requires not obedience, but insight. It is a paradox as old as mysticism itself. If God wants to be known, why hide? Why speak in symbols? Why wrap truth in riddles? Why communicate through dreams, silence, or paradox, instead of clarity? The mystical traditions of many cultures suggest a provocative answer, because the deepest truths cannot be received passively. They must be earned, not because the divine is cruel, but because the mind must be transformed to see. Kabbalah, Gnosticism, Sufism, Christian mysticism all carry versions of this idea, that God is not merely distant, but encrypted, that scriptures are not manuals, but puzzles, that revelation is not given, but discovered, and only by those willing to descend into unknowing. The Gospel of Thomas, an early Christian text excluded from the biblical canon, opens with these words, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, not whoever believes, but whoever interprets." This is the logic of divine occultism. Salvation, not as submission, but as decoding. This view challenges both orthodoxy and atheism. To the fundamentalist it says, "What you see is not all there is." Literalism blinds. But to the skeptic, it also whispers, "Your rejection may be premature. There is more, but it cannot be grasped by intellect alone. It requires transformation, of attention, of being." Carl Jung, who explored alchemy not as chemistry, but as metaphor, argued that the symbols of the occult were projections of the unconscious, but he did not reduce them. He elevated them. For Jung, these symbols were maps of inner transformation, the soul's way of speaking to itself in a language beyond rationality. In this sense, divine occultism is not about escaping reality, but piercing deeper into it. This also raises the ethical dimension of hidden truth. If some truths are veiled, does that mean they are not meant for everyone? Esoteric traditions often imply this, a division between the initiated and the masses. But the paradox is sharper. The truths are hidden not by gatekeepers, but by our own unreadiness. Anyone can approach, but few persist. Modern society, obsessed with transparency, efficiency, and surface-level accessibility, finds little patience for this. We demand truth now, clearly, quickly. But divine occultism responds, truth is not data, it is experience. And the deepest experiences cannot be downloaded, they must be lived. Imagine trying to explain music to someone who has never heard sound, or love to someone who has never touched another. That is the challenge of divine truth. It cannot be transferred like information. It must be awakened like memory. In that sense, divine occultism is not about hiding for secrecy's sake. It is about reverence, about the idea that some realities are too powerful, too sacred, too alive to be handed over casually. Like fire, they must be approached with care, or they consume rather than illuminate. The modern occult revival, with its fascination for symbols, astrology, and hidden knowledge, often touches this hunger, though sometimes without the depth. The true path of divine occultism is not about novelty or escape. It is about seeing the invisible scaffolding of the world, the divine architecture beneath appearances, and learning to read it. In the end, the paradox stands. If the divine is love, why hide? But perhaps the answer is that hiding is not rejection. It is invitation. An invitation to stop looking with only the eyes and begin seeing with the whole self. The candle still flickers, the smoke still rises, but now the symbols begin to move, not because they changed, but because you did. There is a moment, brief, unsettling, silent, when the voice in your head goes quiet. No more commentary, no more judgment, no more me, just presence. A tree is a tree, a breath is a breath. You are not watching the world, you are the world. Then, as quickly as it came, the voice returns. What was that? And with that question, the ego reappears. The self reassembles. You are once again you, thinking, naming, dividing. This fleeting glimpse points to one of the deepest paradoxes in human experience, the death of the ego, not in the sense of psychological collapse, but in the spiritual existential sense, the dissolution of the illusion that there is a separate, continuous I at the center of experience. Across contemplative traditions, this moment is described not as loss, but as liberation. And yet, it is terrifying. Because to let go of the ego is to let go of everything we believe ourselves to be. In Buddhism, this is anattā, non-self. The idea that the self is not a solid entity but a process, a stream of sensations, thoughts, memories, all clinging to the illusion of permanence. In Advaita Vedanta, it is the distinction between the false self, the ego or jiva, and the true self, Atman, which is not personal but universal. In Christian mysticism, Meister Eckhart wrote, "The soul must lose itself to find God." Across all these paths, the message echoes, to find what is real, the ego must die. But here lies the paradox. Who seeks the death of the ego? The ego itself. It is the ego that reads spiritual books, meditates, attends retreats, all in the hope of transcending itself, like a shadow trying to chase the sun. Every effort to kill the ego can reinforce it, because the striving is itself egoic. Psychologist and author Alan Watts often warned of this trap. The biggest ego trip, he said, is getting rid of your ego. The mind says, I want to be egoless. But who is this I? The structure loops in on itself. The harder you try to dissolve the self, the more it reasserts control. In neuroscience, the ego correlates roughly to the default mode network, the brain system responsible for constructing the narrative self. When this network quiets down, through meditation, psychedelics, or extreme flow states, people report a sense of unity, timelessness, and ego dissolution. But even these experiences, when told afterward, are reabsorbed into the self's story. I had a mystical experience. The paradox becomes sharper. The ego can vanish, but the memory of its vanishing becomes part of its identity. It dies only to use its own death as a badge. Yet this doesn't mean the effort is meaningless. As Zen masters have long pointed out, the goal is not to destroy the ego but to see through it. Like realizing that a mirror is not the face, the ego is not who we are, only a reflection shaped by thought, habit, and time. In this light, the death of the ego is not annihilation, but disidentification. The shift from, I am my thoughts, to thoughts arise within me. This insight doesn't make life passive, it makes it lighter. Decisions still happen, emotions still arise, but without the tight grip of ownership. There is pain, but less suffering. There is joy, but without grasping. There is action, without the need for applause. Still, the ego resists. It fears death, even symbolic death. And in a society that rewards identity, personal branding, opinions, visibility, the ego is constantly fed. We are encouraged to build ourselves, define ourselves, defend ourselves. To die to the self, in this context, can feel like irrelevance or madness. But perhaps the deepest paradox is this. Only when the ego steps aside can something greater emerge. Not a superior self, but the absence of separation. A sense of being lived, rather than being the one who lives. The mystic does not say, I found the truth, but truth is, and I am not separate from it. And so the practice continues, not to kill the ego like an enemy, but to see it like a mask. Useful perhaps, but not real. When it drops, even for a moment, what remains is not emptiness, but peace, spacious, wordless, and whole. And when the voice returns, as it always does, you greet it not with fear, but with a quiet smile. You know now it is not you, not entirely, just another ripple in the vast, silent sea that watches all things arise and pass.